All right. So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan. I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Mr. George Deitch, the Executive Director of the Hagen History Center. George has co-founded several historical organizations related to the Civil War and to the War of 1812 here in Erie, Pennsylvania. He's also helped create the flagship Niagara League, which has played a critical role in reconstructing the U.S. Brig Niagara and creating the Erie Maritime Museum. An historian, an author, George annually teaches history courses at Chautauqua Institution, and for more than 3 decades has given numerous presentations on the Civil War across 7 states as well as the District of Columbia. He's been published in numerous journals and served as a consultant to National Geographic magazine for its Civil War sesquicentennial issue. He earned a degree in history from Mercyhurst University and was also educated at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And of course, he's no stranger to the Jefferson Educational Society stage, as he's presented on a range of topics for us in the past, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to Civil War topics to contentious presidential elections, to his most recent, a digital presentation of Lincoln and Tawney, the great antagonists. Here, we turn our attention to TAPS, 24 Notes of History in Erie County's Oliver Norton. You know the tune, but do you know the history behind it? We're here to learn that, taking us all the way back to the 1860s to work our way through Erie, Pennsylvania's connection to the Civil War, the connection to this song that we are all familiar with, to get to know a bit more about that. Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. We're going to do our best to get those over to George and answer them during this program. If you have some questions and you happen to be watching a later broadcast of this, still send them our way. We're going to do our best to get them over to George Deitch from the Hagen History Center. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit our website at jeserie.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Mr. George Deitch, thank you for joining us for this second digital presentation. One that I've enjoyed personally at the Jefferson stage. Glad we could bring it to viewers here digitally. TAPS. Thanks for being with us, George.
Thanks, Ben. Well, we'll get started off. You can see the folded flag, the bugle, and it says TAPS 150, 1862 to 2012. I was involved in the 150th anniversary of the creation of TAPS. Of course, I knew about TAPS being from Erie, and you'll find out how and why. But in 2012, a group got together, formed a nonprofit, and we helped to celebrate the 150th anniversary. We'll get into all that. So I've been involved with TAPS for quite some time. It's a fascinating subject, and hope we can enlighten you a bit today. Let's talk a little bit about Erie County in 1860. We had over 49,000 people. The city was about 20% of that. Mill Creek had about half the number of the city, a little over half, and there were 9 other townships that had up to 2,400 people. So Erie County itself was much larger in proportion to the rest of us than the city was today. Overwhelmingly an agricultural county. There are approximately 9,800 males of military age, and much higher than the national average. About 2/3 of those men of military age served in the Army or Navy, and Navy is important because of the USS Michigan in our port on Lake Erie. Over 1,000 men from Erie served in the Navy. Well, let's get down to one of the main characters here, Oliver Willcox Norton. Norton was born in Allegheny County, New York. He was one of 13 children of a Presbyterian minister's family. He would move to Erie County. He taught school in Girard. He was lived in actually Springfield Township. And at the age of 19, he entered the local militia unit. And you can see his picture as a very young man. We have the original in our collection. And the Girard military militia would become part of our first Civil War unit. So Erie County prepares for war. There were several pre-war militias, the Wayne Guard, which is probably the most famous, the Girard Guards, of which Norton was a private. And then they came together when the war started in April of 1861 to form the Erie Regiment, also called McLean's. It was a 90-day unit, trained here locally, went to Camp Wilkins in Pittsburgh to train again. And there were, it was not called up to be a numbered unit in the Pennsylvania military. Created a great deal of dissension. As it turned out, its 90 days was up in January or July of 1861, right before the Battle of Bull Run. So they saw no combat. After that, McLean was called again by the governor to form a new regiment. It was called the 83rd Pennsylvania, or PVI is Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. And it was named 83rd because that was in line of the number. There were over 200 Pennsylvania regiments that were formed. And it became a 3-year regiment. Over 1,000 men from Erie, Crawford, and Forest counties. Because of the dissension at Camp Wilkins, few joined from the Girard militia. Norton was an exception. In September, they moved from training in Erie to the defenses of Washington, D.C. in Hall's Hill was where they camped. That's kind of on the lower left-hand quadrant of the map. These were the early defenses of Washington, and they trained, got their true military training there. You can see Washington, you can see Georgetown on the far right-hand side, and the darker areas of Washington. So the 83rd Regiment became quite arguably an elite regiment in the Federal Army. It was brigaded under Brigadier General Daniel Butterfield, more on him in a minute. He was an exacting taskmaster. What does brigading mean? It means it was put together with several other regiments under the next highest unit, which was called a brigade. Butterfield sent them through intensive training, drilling, discipline, court-martials for even the smallest infractions. The 83rd excelled in this, and it won a drill competition and was awarded these fancy French uniforms. You can see a picture of how these guys looked. One of the problems was that most Frenchmen were a little smaller than most Americans. So for the most part, these guys, when they got their pictures taken, probably had to suck in their chests a little bit because these uniforms just didn't fit very well. They weren't very practical for field service. So right before the first campaign, they shipped them all out to Harrisburg. Very few of these uniforms still survive today. This is a couple of photographs of the Paul's Hill. You can see on the left-hand side, they were very festive. They had these arches of greens. And then after Christmas, that first Christmas, it suddenly turned very cold. And you can see kind of the afterwards on the right-hand side with the heavy snows. And life was not quite as happy in the camps that winter. Part of their drilling, again, they won the fancy uniforms, one of 3 regiments in the entire Army. And the Army commander stated that they were one of the very best regiments. This is their battle, this is their second battle flag. You can see here, it's in this condition. It's in Harrisburg in the state archives. But the unit would perform admirably well throughout its campaigns. And there's Dan Butterfield. Dan Butterfield would be the brigade commander. He was the other major player in this story. He was born in Utica, New York in 1831. Came from a very wealthy family. His father was the founder of what we now know as American Express. He became a colonel. This is a colonel's uniform in the 12th New York State Militia. Would then go to Washington, offer his regiment and offer his services to the government, and was promoted to brigadier general. He would, during the Peninsula campaign, which is the first campaign, win the Medal of Honor alongside of the 83rd Pennsylvania by seizing their colors during a swirling battle. He would go on to become much more than just a brigade commander and the author of Taps. We'll talk a little bit more about him as we go. In May of 1862, the Union Army sailed down the Chesapeake Bay to the peninsula that runs between the James and the York River. Many of you know where Williamsburg is, or Jamestown. These are toward the bottom of this map on the right-hand side. They were landed at Fort Monroe, which was a federal fortress which had not surrendered to the Confederates. And very, very slowly, they moved their way up the peninsula. They got up to that first red line you see on the right-hand side, and the Confederates had erected defenses, mostly, interestingly enough, with essentially tree trunks painted black to make them look like there were a lot of big cannon. George McClellan was totally fooled. They outnumbered the Confederates there probably 10-1, but yet the Confederates were able to march their troops back and forth, make themselves look a lot stronger. So McClellan settled in for a siege. So the first real action that the 83rd Pennsylvania ever had was digging trenches and then digging more trenches. Finally, when they were about to open up on the Confederate lines, the Confederates disappeared up the river, and the movement then would go slowly for the 60 miles toward Richmond. When they finally got up to the left-hand side of the map, you'll see at the very top, it'll say May 27th in Porter. That would be the first action of the 83rd Pennsylvania. They would lose a handful of men in their first combat. But then things would settle down into a protracted siege beginning at Richmond. And you can see on the left-hand side, again on the very top of that map, you see Porter, and he is there almost alone on the second part of that map. You see a circle saying McCall and Porter. The entire rest of the army is south of the river that runs between them. Lee moved his entire army, except for a few men, north and struck at Porter. And on the very left-hand side, right next to the river, you see on the right-hand side of the map that says Butterfield. That's the brigade that the 83rd was in. The 83rd held the most farthest left-hand end of the Union line. And they were battered for hours, multiple attacks. They threw all of them back, causing the Confederates very heavy casualties. And then there was a breakthrough beyond their flank. The Confederates broke through. They moved behind the 83rd and the rest of the troops, and the 83rd was nearly surrounded. It was a terrible fight. Finally, after being surrounded on essentially three sides, the 83rd broke to the river, which is toward the bottom of the map, and escaped. Most of the men with no equipment, they just simply swam the river. Terrible fight. That was the second of the 7 days battles at Gaines's Mill. The last of the 7 days battles came on July 1st at Malvern Hill. The men had been re-equipped. Again, Lee is on the attack. Again, the 83rd Pennsylvania is on the far left-hand side of the army. This time, Lee's attacks were not so successful. Through multiple attacks against the Union troops, this is Griffin's battery. You can see the Confederates below. One of the things is that this battery is almost overrun by a Confederate attack. The 83rd and the 44th New York, the two of them were in support of this battery. They charged down the hill, saved the battery, captured a Confederate flag, and but they paid a horrible price. By the end of the 7 days campaign, the 83rd Pennsylvania, which had started the campaign rather, 600 men were down to some 80 men. So you can imagine the horrific casualties that they took, going from 600 down to just 80. Well, even though the battle at Gaines's Mill was a terrible loss, the battle at Malvern Hill was actually a Union victory. But George McClellan, the Union commander, was so beaten psychologically that he pulled the army out of Malvern Hill and retreated down to the James River under protection of the Union Navy, and set up shop at Berkeley Plantation. It became a very hot, sultry summer, both armies licking their wounds. And there, on a hot, sultry day, Dan Butterfield, who had his tent pitched with a lot of covering, decided that he would take the opportunity to change a tune that was a lights out tune, an old French tune, and make it more to his liking. Butterfield was a very interesting character. Even though he could not read music, he did indeed decide that he wanted his troops to hear a different bugle call than the rest of the army did. As a matter of fact, for the standard bugle calls, he would compose a preface to it that would signal his troops that could be on march for as lengthy as a mile long, that this bugle call was for them. And it would have a cadence that would go as they would call it, Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield, Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield. I can't whistle, so I can't do it. But Butterfield would actually admit later on that his troops would often sing, instead of Dan Butterfield, they'd go, damn, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield. But soldiers do love to complain. So on a sultry, hot night in early July, as the Union Army is licking its wounds, and you can see in the background of this how close he was to the Berkeley Plantation, he called in the bugler from the 83rd Pennsylvania, Oliver Norton, Private Norton, to compose a new tune for Lights Out for the troops. And Butterfield, as I mentioned, could not write music. He had basically took this old French tune. He had Norton play a bar or two. He'd lengthen or shorten the notes. And so ultimately, the 24 notes of taps was composed that way. It was Butterfield to Norton, Norton playing back to Butterfield, and then Norton actually was the one that would write the notes down, again, to save the composition. And so that really is how taps was created. The two men, after a horrible campaign there in July, and I'll read you in a minute or two what Norton would have to say about what happened with the creation of taps. So for years, there was, I guess, rumor, perhaps, how taps was invented. There were plenty of things that went around. It was a Confederate officer. It was somebody inventing this to call after his dead son. And the rumors grew and grew. Well, in 1891, Century Magazine, which was essentially the life magazine of the time, and had published years and years of memoirs of Civil War soldiers, put out a question. Do you know how taps really came about? Norton, seeing that, wrote into Century Magazine explaining what it was. And then he said, I'm an older man, my recollection may be fading. Contact General Butterfield. They did. Butterfield wrote into Century Magazine. And this is where Norton had actually given Butterfield credit for writing taps down. But Butterfield would come back in his reply and said, I never learned music. I could blow a bugle, but I never learned music. And said it was basically Norton that had actually written taps down for the first time. Norton would go on the night sounding taps for his for the brigade, and he would write in that Century article, quickly, buglers from all over the division and then all over the Army flocked to Butterfield's headquarters to find out this song was so appealing to them. And Norton handed out copies of, handwritten copies of taps to all the buglers, all from the division, from the Corps, from the Army that came to find out about that. So it quickly spread throughout the Army of the Potomac.
George,
And
I think
indeed,
this might be a really good place. Sorry to interrupt you, but we've got an audience question, and I'm curious too here. How common were buglers? Did every regiment have a bugler? Was it every brigade? How many buglers were there? So when we get a sense of this being passed around,
every regiment would have a bugler, and just typically there were 4 regiments per brigade, 3 brigades per division, 3 divisions per corps, and 6 Army corps. So you can multiply that out. There literally hundreds of buglers in the Army. So, but it became very widespread very quickly. Eventually, the Confederates picked it up, and then when 2 of the Army Corps went west to the Western Theater in late 1863 after Gettysburg, they carried taps with them, and the Federal armies in the West quickly adopted taps. It was originally as a lights out, but as early as 1863, it was also being used as a funeral call, a funeral dirge, so to speak. So it spread like wildfire throughout the Army. But neither Norton nor Butterfield fully appreciated what they had done. Of course, Norton was the first bugler to sound taps, and it found its way throughout the Army of the Potomac. Again, within a year, it was played over the graves of the deceased soldiers. And even though they had remained anonymous for over 35 years, I don't think until the Century magazine article came out that either one of them tried to claim credit for this wonderful piece. This is Berkeley Plantation today. It's one of the 7 plantations that people can visit along the James River. Just a line or 2 of quick history. It was originally called Harrison's Landing. The Harrison family, which produced 2 presidents, came out of this plantation. It's now privately owned, interestingly enough, by the descendant of a Union soldier who served in the Federal Army and camped at Berkeley Plantation when, well after the war, when Berkeley was in financial trouble. That man came down from New York, bought the plantation, and his family has owned it ever since. It's a wonderful place to visit, and you can see here the mansion in the upper left. Just beyond the left of this screen is the road that goes up. You can see at the bottom of the screen is actually the James River. So the 83rd PA at the lower right was camped very close to the river. Butterfield's headquarters closer to the tavern. And then you see just above Butterfield's headquarters, the Taps Monument. 8 years ago, the Taps Monument was renovated with money from Erie. The group of folks that I was involved with for the Strong Vincent Commemoratives Committee, we raised money to restore this monument and to put a recording in. You can see that on the right. So if somebody presses the button, they can hear the story of taps, and they can also hear a rendering of the music. And so it's a beautiful memorial. You can look beyond the memorial itself and see how close the James River was to the camps. Well, just a little bit more on Norton. After this, the 83rd Pennsylvania would go on to fight in many more battles. it would actually become the most, it had the most number of battles of any unit from Pennsylvania in the Federal Army. It would suffer the second highest number of battle deaths. It was commanded after John McClane was killed at Gaines's Mill. It would eventually be commanded by Strong Vincent. Norton became Vincent's aide, and he would become the brigade bugler. The picture of the brigade flag was carried by Norton. He carried it at Gettysburg on a little round top. His family still has that flag, and a number of years ago, when the new library was being opened, I happened to have a connection to the family, Norton's family, and we had an exact copy made of that flag. That flag sat in a drawer at the Chautauqua Institution for 100 years, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But this is Norton later in the war. He would go on, was kind of tired of being a corporal 2 years into the war. Vincent had been mortally wounded at Little Round Top, and Norton thought he could find a better place for himself. He was a prolific letter writer, wrote about 150 letters home, and in that he talks to his sister about wanting to become an officer. And so the Union Army was starting to recruit black troops. They were called the United States Colored Troops. You actually had to take a test to become an officer, and there were only white officers. Black men could become NCOs, like sergeants, corporals, but it was white officers only. Norton tested, was selected as a first lieutenant in the 8th USCT, would go on to have a distinguished record with them. He would write that it was, I think, in his 17th battle. He was, many brushes in those 17 battles that he had, but he was almost killed at the battle leading his company. But he'd become the brigade quartermaster eventually, and end the war with the 8th USCT as part of the Army of Occupation in Texas, interestingly enough. After the war, he would become a millionaire when millionaires really counted. It would be an Elon Musk or a Buffett or one of those guys, Bezos from Amazon. He made that much money. He and his brother got into the tin can business, American tinning, and he would merge with a company in Chicago, and they would become the dominant tin can maker for America. And he would do extremely well. He attended all of the reunions, including one on Gettysburg, which he wrote extensively. He would write 3 books on his Civil War experiences, including his letters. All of them very interesting to read. His last book was written after he was totally blind. He dictated it to his secretary. He would die in 1914, a wealthy man and a man who was truly a hero. He would strike up he had a very close relationship with Strong Vincent. And after the war, he would strike up a lasting friendship with Elizabeth Vincent, who was Strong Vincent's wife. She lived in Cincinnati. He lived in Chicago, but they corresponded all the time. When she passed away, she sent enough money to Norton to have Norton buy, as she put it, the finest box of cigars. He turned around and sent the money back to her favorite charity in Cincinnati. This sword is the presentation sword that was given to Strong Vincent. It's on display at the Smithsonian. Excuse me for a second. Lizzie Vincent gave that sword to Oliver Norton's son, who was named Strong Vincent Norton. But Norton decided that his son was not worthy of the memory of his namesake, and he gave it back to Lizzie. Elizabeth when she died, made a bequest to the Smithsonian, and they have had it on display off and on ever since. I mentioned Chautauqua earlier. Norton would become a good friend of a distant cousin of Strong Vincent, Bishop Vincent, who was one of the two founders of Chautauqua. He and his family would build a home along the lake, which they owned until about 5 years ago. They sold it. I was in that home a few times. Wonderful place. And that's where they had kept the Brigade flag for 100 years. They had it in a cedar chest drawer. And I was able to have the privilege of opening up the drawer, taking it out, spreading it out, photographing it. And I had a seamstress from Erie come up, and she produced the copy, which is now in the Blasco Library's Heritage Room. So both Norton and his son died fairly close together. And so Norton's widow bequeathed not only the money to build the Opera House, which you're looking at, Norton Hall at Chautauqua, but she had a very peculiar request. Most of you who are opera fans know that the opera are almost always in Italian. And but her catch for her money was to make sure that all the operas performed in the Opera House were performed in English. So if you go to Chautauqua, you go to the opera in the Opera House, you'll hear only English operas, and that's because of Mrs. Norton. So there's a lasting memorial to Norton at the Chautauqua Institution. It is still endowed, obviously, from the bequest that she made. So that is the story of Norton. Now let's switch over to Dan Butterfield. As we mentioned, he came from a wealthy family. After his stint as brigade commander, he would go to command a division, go on to command a corps, which was about 15,000 men or so. And then he would be tapped as the Army Chief of Staff. That's him sitting down on the far right. The guy with the rather crazy hairdo next to him is a character by the name of Joseph Hooker. And Hooker was commander of the Army for several months in early 1863 until his disastrous campaign at Chancellorsville. Well, he and Norton took the Army from a really depth of despair and poor morale after several defeats to Robert E. Lee. And the two of them turned the Army around and gave it an esprit de corps. They also were both partiers. They were well known to have their headquarters with lots of liquor and lots of women, just aside. But Butterfield would outlast Hooker. With the Army of the Potomac, Hooker would be relieved. George Gordon Meade, who was commander of Strong Vincent and the 83rd Pennsylvania, would become the new Army commander, would keep Butterfield on as the Chief of Staff through the Battle of Gettysburg until Butterfield was wounded at the battle. Butterfield would not have the greatest relationship with Meade. After his wounding, Meade found the opportunity to replace him. Butterfield would go on, when Hooker became Army commander out west, would go on to become a Chief of Staff for Hooker out there. His army would consist of the two corps that went out to the west in the fall of 1863. He would also then become he wanted to become a corps commander again out there, but the politics of the Western Army were much different than the politics of the Eastern Army. Hooker fell out of favor, and therefore his Chief of Staff fell out of favor. But what would happen was, as a good politician, Butterfield would go back, would become not only toward the end of the war, would still hold command, but this time in New York Harbor. But he would go on then to be a powerful man in the country. He would, unfortunately, fall into some corruption at the time of Ulysses S. Grant. I don't know how many of you know much about Grant's administration, but Grant certainly was ill-served by the people closest to him. And Butterfield was a high up in the Treasury Department in New York. He was partially involved with buying gold. He fell in with two crafty speculators. You may know the names from your history, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk. And what would happen was one of Grant's close friends would arrange for inside information to go to Gould and Fisk about buying and selling federal treasuries and gold. Gould would then give Butterfield a personal check for $10,000, basically to get tipped off before the government was going to make a move on gold. And once the conspirators met with the president to convince him about the U.S. purchase of gold, the price of gold skyrocketed by 15 times. And Grant found out that this was about to happen. He felt he was used, and right afterwards he ordered the government to sell the gold holdings that they had, dropping the price from, it was $150 at that time, and it ended up going down to by about 90% almost overnight. So it was a nasty situation, and Butterfield got called in to a congressional hearing, and he claimed that the $10,000 he received was simply a loan, but when asked about the terms to paying back, he didn't have any answers. So he quickly resigned his position, took his family to Europe for about 3 years, and waited until everything had died down. Afterwards, when he came back to the country, he again was commissioned a high position in New York with the Port of New York, and would go on to live out his life fairly untouched by the scandal that he was in the middle of. Butterfield would die in 1901, and he's one of the very few, as a matter of fact, I think he was the first man to be buried at West Point who was not a West Point graduate. Not only because of his influence, but mainly because of TAPS and how important that was to the Army and all the services. He not only was buried at West Point, but he had this magnificent monument that was built over his grave. And when in 1901 he was buried, taps was sounded over the grave. And there's also a monument in New York City to him near Grant's tomb. So his lasting legacy to the country was the fact that he was an effective general, and his issues which drove him out of government, that bribe of $10,000, didn't have a lasting effect on his reputation in terms of the Army. And he ended up, again, well honored for his services and well honored for TAPS. Finally, TAPS was officially recognized in 1874, and it became the standard of military funerals in 1891. In 74, it was recognized as lights out. In 91, it was officially a funeral dirge. However, it had been played at funerals, as I mentioned, going back to the Civil War. This is a Tiffany window that is in the Soldiers and Sailors Home, the chapel of the Soldiers and Sailors Home, giving honor to Norton, who you see in the bottom right. It's a great piece. If you once you're able to get back, I would highly recommend anybody taking a tour of the Soldiers and Sailors Home. It's a great chapel. The Soldiers and Sailors Home was was the first one built in Pennsylvania, and it housed Civil War soldiers beginning in the 1880s. And they created this magnificent chapel, so that, quite frankly, the Tiffany window itself is worth the price of admission. For about a year, we actually had Norton's letter book, handwritten letter book, on exhibit. It's owned by a friend of mine who lives a couple blocks down from my Maryland house, and he was a bugler for the Air Force for 30 years, 24 of which he played taps at Arlington. And he and I have an agreement: when he decides that he's going to give this up, that letter book with 150 letters is coming back to Erie County. So, questions or comments? I'll be happy to field them.
George, that was fantastic. A big thanks to you, and a big thanks, of course, to everybody tuning in to watch this live presentation. And, of course, a thanks, too, for everybody watching perhaps a later broadcast of this. George, one of the questions, a couple of them we've actually gotten through with your presentation. One I interrupted you for. I asked about whether every regiment had a bugler, every brigade, and you had a great answer there. Another one that was covered in your presentation was, when did taps become an official part of military discipline? But one of the questions we didn't get a chance to get to is, what is the significance of the monument? One of our audience members asks. The significance of the monument to Butterfield in Manhattan's Upper West Side near Grant's tomb.
Well, it was, Butterfield, as I mentioned, had come from a wealthy, influential family. He had spent a great deal of time after the war, after his hiatus from the old Grant affair, being a successful businessman, being the head of the port of New York, and helping to represent the military. The city of New York honored him with a statue or with a monument right near Grant's tomb. I mean, that's how high of esteem that the city held Butterfield in. For as well known as the song Taps is, why don't you think we know this story as much as perhaps the music? What happened here, George? Well, I think, first of all, because neither Norton nor Butterfield stepped forward in the 25 years after the war, 35 years after the war, to claim credit, there were a slew of different myths that grew up around it. There's a book that probably has 2 or 3 chapters, 30, 40 pages of different myths that came up. I'd say certainly a century and a quarter ago, once the series of magazine articles came out, people knew about that. But quite frankly, the tale behind the song faded, as many things do in the period of history that we go through. And so people just forgot. And again, Butterfield being a major player, especially on the East Coast, got a lot of credit. Norton, although he became a very wealthy man, wasn't a glory hound. And so his part, again, faded, and especially in Erie County. It's amazing. I mean, you go to Strong Vincent First High School, now middle school, a lot of these kids have no clue who Strong Vincent was, and even less clue folks in Erie know who Oliver Willcox Norton was. So it's one of those things that, things fade in history, and that happens to be one of them. But it is a great story for Erie County. And the reason why I went off screen here, I thought maybe as anybody else wants to write in and then wants to look at the questions, I'd simply play Taps for everybody. George, thanks for queuing that up. We're going to hope that it comes through and everybody can hear it. While you're taking a look at that, one more question that's come in is, when and how were the words added to the tune of Taps? That's an interesting question. Taps, it's an unofficial lights out. I mean, I could recite them to you. I have them here, but somebody felt they had to put words to it. So there's a couple of different versions. It's called "The Day Is Done," and unfortunately, that's not playing very loud. Let me see if I can cue that up again.
Yeah, so one of the things, George, we can do later is we'll post that in the comments section, a link so folks can get a chance to hear that, as well as if you have any of the versions, George, with the lyrics or different versions of the lyrics, we can go ahead and post that.
I'll see if I can find the lyrics to it if I can. I'll be certainly happy to post that. Oops, let's go back. This is the 3rd Pennsylvania regimental flag, 83rd Pennsylvania. The first one I showed you had some bullet holes, some tears. This is the 3rd one. The first one is at the Blasco Library's Heritage Room, which is in terrible shape because it went through 2 years of terrible fighting. But these colors do exist, and again, this is an opportunity for you to get your kids to understand a little bit of history. When we are now open the Hagen History Center in the mansion, which has our Civil War collection, also our new children's exhibit, also the Justice Bell, which is a replica of the Liberty Bell, which is a part of the women's suffragette movement. And that'll be here for about another month. So I'd encourage you to come down, visit us. We have all the safety precautions, must wear masks, we have hand sanitizers, but we are open. The other 7 exhibits that we have been working on so hard, hopefully will open in August. We're not completely sure yet, it all depends on COVID, but you can see a lot of Erie's Civil War heritage in the mansion at the Hagen History Center.
So one of the comments in the comment section on Facebook, George, just simply says, "Excellent. I couldn't help but agree more. This is a fantastic presentation. We appreciate you taking the time and being with us today." Mr. George Deitch, the Executive Director of the Hagen History Center, thank you for joining us for this program and teaching us more about Oliver Norton and TAPS in Erie and its connection to the Civil War. Really appreciate that, George.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for everybody tuning in.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks, thanks for tuning in live, watching us on Facebook, and anybody watching a later broadcast of that, we greatly appreciate it. George, you gave a plug of some of the exhibits for folks looking for more information about the Hagen History Center, where to find you, Facebook, Twitter, website. Where should we point people to, George?
Well, we are on Facebook. You can, Erie County Historical Society, which is our legal name. You can go there. You can go to the website, which is eriehistory.org, eriehistory.org. Those are probably the 2 best places to find us. We also have an Instagram account, which you can look at more pictures, but the Facebook and the website are the key ones.
Excellent. And to find out more information about both upcoming as well as past programs from the Jefferson, as well as our publications, head over to our website at jeserie.org. Be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for learning and listening with us.